You know, when I think back to my 20 years of schooling, there are actually only 2 classes that I can remember taking that I actually put to good use. One was junior high school typing, and the other was my forensics class that I took in my senior year in high school that really changed my life. Unfortunately, the typing class didn't teach me to type on a phone, so I still lack important skills. I haven't been able to make the adaptation from the keyboard to the phone. But the debate class really served me well and continues to serve me well through various careers that I've had both in academia and journalism and now running an NGO, a nonprofit, including I used to do these almost daily, or actually daily, live segments for CBS News around the country. And sometimes the anchor would ask me the wrong question. They didn't understand the topic. They told me I was going to talk about X, and they wound up talking about Z. So when you talk about being able to think fast, when you're on live radio and you have to change topics and you haven't done any preparation, thank God for high school debate and Google. Because between the two, I actually was able to manage most of the time. So one last comment, and the Attorney General said it, and Andrew said it. I can't think of a more important moment to be celebrating debate, because it is really the essence of critical thinking. I mean, having to argue both sides of an issue has been so valuable in my life, and I think the life of everybody who's done debate. And when I turn on cable news and I see one side on one channel and another side on another channel and very little dialogue or very little understanding that the possibility of reaching a consensus, I'm really fortunate that at least some of us have had the ability to really look at things from all different sides. Perhaps we don't even agree with one side we're arguing, but the ability to articulate a position is so important. And I'm so pleased that thanks to this organization, many students are learning these skills, and hopefully they will become leaders and replace some of the leaders that we now have that are causing part of the problems. So with that, I will open up the discussion and begin with a question about how in your particular work, and you take a moment, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but talk a little bit about yourselves and your work. How in your work have you seen practices that either perpetuate or somehow improve on the social and economic disparities in the tech world? Because I think we all agree there are plenty in the tech world. Tech has the potential to alleviate some of the problems, but it also has the potential to make them worse. So I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about your own observations from the work you've done. Britton, why don't we start with you? Is your mic on?
There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Britton Heller. I am a lawyer, but I am a nice person.
I can testify to that.
And I've practiced human rights law with an emphasis on technology for about 15 years. A lot of my work has been field work, and so I have actually taken a walk on the wild side. I've been able to see the impact of technology on disparate populations around the world. For me, the privilege of using technology really needs to be balanced by an awareness of its power and its risks. One example that comes to mind for me was right before the pandemic, I decided one pandemic was not enough. I was going to go and do field work in Uganda where they had an Ebola outbreak at the same time. I was there working with the Human Rights Center at Berkeley and the US State Department, and I had a research grant to look at how post-electoral violence that was allegedly instigated by social media was playing out in this one region. It's called Kasese. It's at the border of the DRC and Uganda. During that research, we studied hate speech. And I developed a definition of hate speech from a community-centric point of view. It came from the community. They told me that the worst thing one politician could call another was Coca-Cola bottle. And that has always stuck with me enough that I wrote an academic paper about it called Coca-Cola Curses, because it would never be picked up by automated AI-driven content moderation. In many parts of the world, in global majority countries, there are competing layers of context. I had to ask someone to explain why Coca-Cola was such a bad word. And they explained to me a few things. One, the gods must be crazy, meant the movie, or one politician was calling the other a colonial tool like Coca-Cola and basically saying they were ignorant. Second, Coca-Cola is a dark beverage, and so there were racist overtones to the epithet. One politician was calling the other one, the recipient was from the pygmy tribe, so it was actually shorter. So a Coca-Cola bottle was supposed to be the size of the gentleman. And there's a theory in law called dangerous speech, and that's hate speech that incites violence. It follows predictable patterns throughout societies, throughout time. And one of these patterns is dehumanization. When you are done drinking your Coca-Cola, what do you do with the bottle? You throw it away. It's garbage or trash. So he's calling his opponent trash or garbage. This is a fun little story that I hope exemplifies why we need to be aware of how AI is going to impact everyone in the room. Not just the people that we talk to every day, not even our neighbors or people in other states, but really a global society.
Great. Yeah.
All right. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. This is an amazing event. I'm on the governance team at Google that's responsible for operationalizing our AI principles, which is our ethical constitution for advanced technology. And I think it's a really interesting role to have because I think we're all too often, especially in the Valley, and I might have just been here for too long, but I think we get seduced with the idea of technological innovation rather than the impacts that it has. And so, what we do and what I do on a fairly constant basis, which seems kind of a unique thing, but something I think also that's reflective of the times and the maturity curve of technology, is really just ask, is this technology socially beneficial? Could it be used? Could it be misused? Or could it create harms in the world? And I think all too often we don't make the distinction between what is a business benefit and what is a social benefit. And I think conflating those two things gets us into a whole lot of trouble, and we've seen that in everything from our political discourse to issues like economic inequality. And so I think at a very simplistic level, it's important that we have that self-awareness to constantly ask ourselves that question. Is this socially beneficial, or does it create harm? But then I think at a more practical level, there are things that we do at Google, but then I think more so we could do across the board. One is to be very, very careful with sensitive applications of AI. So things like autonomous decision systems that could impact things like loan approvals or job recruitment. Another thing that we do that I think is really useful is before applications get released into the wild, that you conduct adversarial testing and you stress test it, you red team it, to really make sure that it's, you tried to break it essentially to see, just to make sure that you're mitigating against the worst harms occurring in the world. So that's what I would start.
All right. How can I possibly follow both of you? But thank you all for having me here today. Alana Goldman-Blumenfeld, Director at PwC. I lead a lot of our work in the space of responsible AI. I've been a practicing data scientist for well over a decade, so I'm first and foremost an AI optimist. But I think with all of the excitement around AI and other types of emerging technology, we really do have an obligation to think about how that technology will ultimately be used, how it could potentially go wrong, and what our responsibility is to instantiate appropriate safeguards. So reflecting on what both of you have already said, which I think are incredible points, there's this broader notion of the fact that AI has already and is already impacting our lives from cradle to grave. and not just here in the US, but certainly globally. Many decisions that we face in our lives at some point in time have some type of an algorithm behind it. And even something as simple, we were hearing from some amazing students earlier who are now accepted in incredible universities, but even university admissions processes have algorithms behind them. Literally everything has some type of an algorithmic decision underpinning it. And we need to be thinking about what that means to us personally and what that means to us as communities, how people could potentially be excluded from participating in important events in their life or get access to critical services, or how we might be incorporating technology that works in one culture particularly well, but deploying it on communities that don't operate the same way or don't have the same type of cultural norms. So all of those are questions that we need to be thinking about when we're designing technology to make sure it works well for us. And I'll add to your list of questions, which I think are fantastic, but should this even exist, or should we even use technology to drive this decision, is something we don't ask ourselves enough. Sometimes layering in human wisdom, human intelligence, going off of tacit knowledge and experience is better. In some senses, it's not, and there are appropriate ways to use technology to augment our decision making.
So I want to insert a question that wasn't on the list, but I've been covering technology long enough, really since the beginning of the personal computer era, to see a handful of paradigm shifts. And there've only been a handful. They don't come along very often. I mean, the World Wide Web was one, broadband was one. There aren't many. But certainly generative AI is one of them. And what I've noticed with every paradigm shift, there are new winners, there are new losers. Companies that are doing well sometimes don't do so well. People we've never heard of become the next cadre of billionaires. As we look at this paradigm shift, especially in light of the mission of this organization and the constituency that this organization serves, how can we be assured, or at least improve the probability, that some of the winners will be people who have not had a seat at the table, and that the population which has traditionally been marginalized won't actually be collectively losers? Because I worry that paradigm shifts, although they tend to change who gets rich and who gets poor, still tend to favor the same general class of people that the previous paradigm shifts have favored. So what can we do now? We have a chance to kind of do it again. What can we do now? Anybody can take that.
I think one fear I have with this current pace of innovation that we have is that the potential to I would say further the digital divide is incredibly significant, because to actually learn to use generative AI applications necessitates that you have a computer and you have a connection to internet, which, let's be honest, not everybody does. And so if you don't have access to those critical resources, it's not going to be fair to expect that you'll be able to keep pace with the innovation and your own experiences with that innovation in order to be able to participate in that type of an economy going forward. So I think recognizing that is a really important step that we have to take. We have to find ways to mitigate for that digital divide, to bring other people into the fold, make sure that they have exposure to emerging technology, that they can play with it, they can interact with it, and also impart their own intuition and intelligence on how these systems operate, because there's something very critical that we're missing by not including those populations.
That's very well said. A lot of my work has focused on seeing how governments around the world are starting to apply generative AI to judicial systems. That is the right answer, whoever just went, And one thing, an essential piece of the puzzle is making sure that we educate both policymakers and members of the general public about how these systems work. If generative AI if machine learning is basically a big pattern recognition machine, because machine learning is basically a big pattern recognition machine, it is going to perpetuate the patterns that we already see. And so in some of my work, it's been going to governments who are using generative AI to research and write part of their judicial opinions, and having to argue that you shouldn't do that when there are substantial life, liberty, and property interests at stake. If we don't educate policymakers with this knowledge at this point, then we later down the road may find some entrenchment of unequal outcomes.
Great points. And just to add to that, I think it's really important to demystify what AI is. And I think all too often it's perceived, especially generative AI, as being magical and all too powerful. And I think that exacerbates some of those divides because there's a perception that there's those that know and there's a lot of people that just don't know. And so I think, if you just substituted AI for, sophisticated forms of automation, I think then it's a lot easier to sort of deconstruct what really needs to be asked, which is, what are we automating? Who does that benefit? And, ultimately, why are we doing it? And I think that's, really important as a thought exercise to do so that it benefits all communities as equitably as possible.
Shifting gears for just a second, from a practical standpoint, if you look at products like ChatGPT or Bard or Bing or any of the others, they can be used to create content almost from thin air, or they can be used to enhance your critical thinking and your understanding and your research to allow you to be more creative. I worry that just as automation has always done, there are people whose jobs will be replaced by AI, but I also have some optimism that there are, in addition to new jobs that we can't even imagine, which will come from AI, that AI will be able to make us more productive in our work. I mean, I remember saying many, many years ago, a word processor won't make you a great writer any more than a food processor will make you a great chef. But it was hard to imagine writing today without a word processor. And great writers and not so great writers have used word processors to improve their craft. So I'm curious your thoughts about where AI is going to play, how it's going to be misused, how it'll be used, and that's a lot of questions, who it's going to replace and who it's going to enhance. So you can take any pieces of those.
So I have a belief that not a single role will not be no role will be unimpacted by artificial intelligence. We're already seeing that today. If for no other reason than there's this perception that there's a business imperative to incorporate AI into everything, whether or not it fits into that existing process. But there certainly are some fantastic use cases that we see almost every function within, and I take an enterprise lens to this, but within an enterprise we see many, many use cases that are being incorporated. So then the question becomes, who can adapt quickly to incorporate that technology into their existing workflow? How can they leverage the capabilities, the tooling that they have, to your point about word processors, most effectively so that they can do their jobs more effectively, faster, more impactfully? Several decades ago, we had similar conversations about spreadsheets being used to automate away accountants. Accountants are still here. We just happen to use a lot of spreadsheets in accounting. So similar vein, how can we reframe AI and other types of technology as what they are, which are assistive tools to help us facilitate our jobs? Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that there won't be an impact, because you have to be able to adapt and incorporate those tools. If you can't, then those are the people who will be left behind. So we have to do our diligence, too, to ensure we're bringing everybody with us as we're instantiating that change.
I get it. When I look at things through a social justice-related lens, following patterns and continuing what we've always done is not necessarily the best way to augment human potential. And my hope for AI-related tools is that this is what we use it for. We use it to augment our abilities and really encourage the best of what we can do. When I look back and see leaps forward, you're talking about paradigm shifts technologically, but when we look at social leaps forward, those have always involved a deviation from the norm. So while AI may help us to really reach our potential, fields and decisions that require exercises of human discretion, or decisions that really relate fundamentally to exercises of human dignity, may fall outside the scope of what AI is currently capable of.
Yeah, I read recently that this new wave of AI is really going to usher in this era of the intuition-based economy, and I happen to believe that because, ultimately, I think what generative AI, is going to enable us to do is optimize information flows. So if you're, educated in a certain way to sort of rote memorize things, that is going to be, I think, less of a value add than adaptability and learning to be lifelong learners. I think the idea of being educated up until the age of 20 is an antiquated notion. And I think those that are going to ultimately thrive in this new world are those that really are lifelong learners and are willing to adapt with the times, because I think that the economy, technology is going to look drastically different in 10, 20, 30 years. And so I think a lot of individual success is going to be predicated on that notion of adaptability.
That is so true. The company you work for has changed forever the notion of having to know facts, because facts are easy to acquire. We may not know if they really are facts anymore, but the fact is that we can gain knowledge, but to know what to do with that knowledge is really what the challenge is. We're almost out of time, but I want to literally bring it home. We all, I believe most of us, live in or near Silicon Valley, which is a wonderful place, great wealth, great opportunity, but also a fair amount of poverty, and often invisible poverty. My wife recently was on the Human Relations Commission in Palo Alto, and I was shocked to learn the extent to which the unhoused population is growing and significant in wealthy Palo Alto. What can we, and I'm using we in a very broad sense of the word, and I would include, by the way, the alumni of your program, what can we collectively do to make Silicon Valley a more egalitarian, I mean, not completely egalitarian, that's wishing for something that's not going to happen, but a more egalitarian community where we don't have the extremes of the people, extreme wealth and extreme poverty, which we do.
What we are doing here today together, why we are sitting here tonight. We are teaching people to raise their voices and to speak out and to be heard. I think that's... I think that's what ultimately saves us, our ability to form communities and to support each other. So thank you to SVUDL for having us all here today.
It's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer outside of saying that I grew up in the Midwest. I went to a small school, and so coming to the Valley was a really daunting proposition, in spite of having a good education and so many opportunities. And I think it just boils down to being willing to take a chance on people that don't come from the same networks and the backgrounds that you come from, because I think all too often it's easy to be in that echo chamber, especially in the Valley, where folks more or less, at least in the tech sector, come from very similar backgrounds. And so I think it comes down to just that open-mindedness of receiving those that come from very different backgrounds and giving them those opportunities.
Very, very well said. I don't live in Silicon Valley. I live in Southern California, so we have our own host of problems. But our unhoused problem is very visible. What I'll add is, back to your point about pattern recognition. So in the technology space, we don't necessarily have the most diverse group of people working to build and sustain technology. And so here in Silicon Valley, I think we have an obligation to broaden that landscape and pull in people from more non-traditional backgrounds, to your point, but also people who don't look like us, who don't have the same experiences as us. That helps us build better solutions, better technology that's more egalitarian in nature, because we can't predict patterns that we haven't seen before when we're using artificial intelligence, back to your point. So if we want to make AI more egalitarian and the technology and the whole Silicon Valley environment that's built on top of that more egalitarian, we need to be folding more people into the fray and recognizing that we need more complex, more diverse backgrounds in order to anticipate how we can we can do better.
Well, as Lawrence O'Donnell says every night, you got the last word. So that's an inside joke for people who watch a certain cable television station. But thank you very much. I appreciate everybody in the panel, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.